Well, nice to meet you all today. Thrilled to be here. This is an amazing turnout. It's an amazing event, actually, and that you are all spending your day this way. And huge shout out to the organizers. This is so well done. And I'm also so glad to be here with all these other speakers and just to put on this day where we're just immersed in all these ideas. So I'm glad to be here. Like he said, my name is Bradley Myles. I've been working on the issue of human trafficking for the past 14 years or so, since right after I graduated from undergrad. Went to Stanford undergrad from 1998 to 2002, and then dove into the human trafficking movement right in 2002. So this has been everything I've been doing, and the provost kind of challenged you all, what are you going to do right after school? And I heard that challenge, but I hadn't learned about human trafficking through the 4 years I went to undergrad. I wanted to work on violence against women issues, and then I learned about human trafficking and dove into this work. So I'm the CEO of Polaris. And Polaris is an organization that works on human trafficking and modern slavery. We combat the networks that are actually committing the crime, and we actually work on restoring freedom to survivors. So we're a local, a national, and a global organization. We've been doing this work since 2002. And for today, what I'd like to really talk about is this future vision of what might it look like to live in a world without slavery. And we wouldn't be doing this work if we didn't believe in that future vision. So normally when I'm out there giving talks, I'm talking about slavery still exists, and I'm trying to raise awareness about that human trafficking is still happening, and I'm describing the problem. Here's how it works, here's how it happens, here's how big it is, here's the scope. It makes $150 billion a day, or $150 billion a year. But I don't want to actually focus on the problem so much today. Today I want to focus on what are some solutions that have been showing progress and promise in the fight against human trafficking over the past 14 years that can be a blueprint for what fighting slavery might look like in the future. So before I dive into that, I just want to give everyone a grounding a little bit in what is human trafficking. Key thing to know is human trafficking is essentially modern slavery. It's profiting from the control and exploitation of other people. And there's a United Nations definition, there's a US law definition, but it breaks down into three pretty simple buckets. The first is kids under the age of 18 who are being exploited in the commercial sex trade. The second is adults who are age 18 or over who are in the commercial sex trade, but they're there because somebody, some third party is holding them there with violence and lies and threat and debt and all these different forms of coercion. So adult sex trafficking. And then this third bucket of all the people who are forced to work against their will. Adults and kids, anybody in any sort of labor or service sector who's there by, again, violence, threats, or coercion. So you've got these three buckets of human trafficking. And what I'd say to you today is that human trafficking is one of the major, most pressing human rights issues facing our world today. But it's not only a human rights issue. It's also a violence against women issue. It's a migration issue. It's a labor issue. It's a business issue. And the theme of today about security, it's a national security issue. And just a few weeks ago, the UN Security Council began to talk about the issue of human trafficking and the security implications of human trafficking around the world with groups like ISIS and others that are now committing sex slavery and human trafficking. So it's all these different things. So in the past 14 years, we've learned a number of lessons along the way. We started serving victims, we started working on laws, and I wanted to illustrate one of those lessons that we learned by introducing you to Deborah. So Deborah's an amazing woman that I met a number of years ago. She's from Tanzania. She had come to the United States thinking that she was going to get a better education, thought she was going to be a domestic worker for a diplomat, working for someone with the World Bank or the IMF or an embassy. And her situation turned into this awful form of abuse, where she was actually held in a home in the suburbs of DC, not allowed outside very frequently, except maybe sometimes on Sundays to take the kids to church, suffered all this unspeakable abuse, threatened, violence, cut off from the outside world. Imagine the level of isolation that she felt, right? Had no idea that this is what was waiting for her when she thought she came to America. And so one day a neighbor noticed her situation and got in touch with Polaris. We wound up getting in touch with the FBI. There was this whole elaborate effort to get her out of that house when the person was at work one day, and all of a sudden she's out of that situation. The FBI drove her to our offices. So we met her the first day that she got out of slavery after this multi-year situation. She was sitting there in our offices, and I'll never forget how bewildered she looked, where she was just looking at us and she was saying, I had no idea that there was police out there that cared. I had no idea that there was organizations out there that worked on this type of issue of people being forced against their will. I had no idea that there was this whole movement out there, and we were describing all of our programs, and she kept saying, I just had no idea you guys existed. And then she looked at us and she said, I had kind of given up on my life. I had just decided I was going to live day to day, but I wasn't really thinking about a future, and I really had kind of given up on the idea that anybody cared. So I heard that theme, and then I heard that theme again from some of the other clients that we worked with. We worked with this one woman named Tori, and we were out on a police raid that day where the police were investigating an underground sex trafficking ring of minors in the DC area that was happening in hotels, where the minors were being posted on this website and sold out of these hotels. And so the police had set up this hotel sting, and we were there, and we were finding these 15 and 16-year-old girls. And then we met this one woman named Tori, and she had just turned the age 18. She had been in the sex trade for years, since she was a kid. And when we met her, she had that same feeling that Deborah felt, where she was just like, I had no idea that there was this whole effort out there trying to work with, quote, people like me, because she had internalized that abuse and oppression. And so she gets out her cell phone and she says, let me show you what it feels like to be me for a day. And she starts scrolling through her cell phone and she starts saying, look at all the text messages I'm receiving. Look at all the phone calls I'm receiving. Every single one of them is either from my pimp, or from a guy trying to buy me for sex, or from another pimp trying to recruit me, or another guy trying to buy me for sex. 100% of the messages that I hear every single day is about using and abusing my body, and I begin to wonder, do they even see me as a human being, or are they just thinking of me as somebody to buy? But where in any of these messages was a message of humanity and a message of this could be better, this life can get better, a message of here's a hotline number that you can call. So she felt that same level of isolation that Deborah felt. This sense of total being cut off, total isolation, this information vacuum. So what we realize is when you start looking at this, there's 21 million survivors of human trafficking, victims of human trafficking all around the world in any given year. This is a UN estimate. And then when you look at how many of them are actually being found, it's about 44,000 in a given year. That's less than 1%. And there's a number of reasons for that. But one of those reasons is, I believe, this sense of hopelessness and this sense of helplessness and folks feeling cut off. It might be a worker in a situation in the Middle East. It might be a domestic worker held in a home like Deborah. It might be a woman under the control of a pimp. It might be someone in an underground brothel. It might be a fisherman on the seas aside Thailand. But folks feel this sense of helplessness. And so what we came to realize was this was the status quo of fighting trafficking around the world 7 or 8 years ago. There was this broken bridge. And on one side of the bridge was the whole human trafficking field. It was the conferences and the laws and the speeches and the nonprofits and the student groups and the church rallies and the candlelight vigils and all the statements and declarations and all the things that we were doing that we thought we were doing to fight trafficking. And on the other side of the bridge were people who were stuck in slavery, sitting there with no clue that this movement existed, no clue of how to reach out for help, no clue of how to signal, I'm stuck in this situation. So we began to say, let's get into the business of bridge building. And we worked on launching this national hotline in partnership with the government because we thought to ourselves, people in slavery, lo and behold, actually have access to mobile devices. When you're under the control of a pimp, you have a cell phone. When you're in one of these situations, you have a cell phone. If you're working on an agricultural crew, sometimes you have access to a cell phone. So this isn't the time of the Underground Railroad anymore when you see a movie like 12 Years a Slave and you're thinking about we have to follow the North Star and we have to sneak out late at night and we have to write a letter somehow and we have to go by lantern and horseback, right? We can access global telecommunications infrastructure in this information age. So how do we then leverage that information age to fight slavery, like a modern-day Underground Railroad? So we began to think, let's launch a texting line. So we launched Be Free, anyone who texts 233733. We launched the national hotline in partnership with the U.S. government. And we began to say, this can't be something that Polaris does alone, but how do we partner with everybody across the United States? So we reached out to about 3,000 nonprofits and said, if we get a call into this national hub, can we refer that call to you? We reached out to all these law enforcement agencies, and we basically built this kind of conceptual modern-day Underground Railroad that's happening through survivors and others signaling through a phone call or texting how to get help, and then we're connecting folks with all this help. And we also said this needs to be 24/7. So Polaris has 24/7 staffing. This needs to be multimodal. It needs to be calls. It needs to be texts. It needs to be all the ways people communicate. And we need to get that number out as much as possible. We need to partner with Google. We need to partner with billboards. We need to get it on radio. We need to get all these folks across the country getting the number out there. So we began working on this bridge, and over 8 years, we received over 100,000 calls into the national hotline, and we wound up learning about 25,000 victims of human trafficking through all these people calling in. And one of the things that I'm most excited about is this statistic, where these are calls directly from survivors. And if you see these numbers, back in 2008, 167, growing to 713, growing to over 2,000, and last year in 2016, 3,500 calls directly from survivors. And many of these are calling from within the situation of trafficking. Like, my pimp just fell asleep, I'm calling to get help, can someone try to get me before he wakes up, right? So this is a sign of progress. We've built this lifeline, and it's beginning to work. It's this national hub, and we are using the information age. But we began to ask ourselves, is this actually ending trafficking? Is this ending slavery? Because we're certainly responding to it, and we're certainly connecting more folks to services, and that's incredibly important. But are we actually making slavery go down from year to year? Because that's our overall mission, is the eradication of the crime. And so we began to think about, what is the actual nature of human trafficking? Human trafficking is a business. And as a business, the people who get into human trafficking are there to make high profit at low risk. It's an economic, financial decision to engage in human trafficking. It's not a crime of power or control. It's not a crime of sadistic, I want to control this other human being. It's a financial decision. And when you interview traffickers, they'll say, yeah, I thought I could make a ton of money selling this person over and over and over again, and I thought no one was going to catch me. So, for us, fighting trafficking is about flipping this equation. How do we decrease profits and increase risk? And what are all the ways to do that? And we began to think, this hotline is not just a lifeline, but look at this heat map of calls that we're getting into the national hotline. This is a representation of the 25,000 cases that we've learned about, all 50 states, and a ton of the calls that are coming into the national hotline have clues about how and where trafficking is happening. And if you begin studying those clues, we could begin crowdsourcing the information and piecing that information together and functioning as a data hub. So we began thinking of the hotline not just as a connect victims to services, work at the case-by-case level, but we could work at the macro trend level, and we could understand what trafficking looks like in this country. So we partnered with Google. We partnered with Salesforce. We partnered with a group called Palantir, Twilio, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters. We began building this data hub, and we hired a team of data analysts. And what we began to do is analyze all the calls and the data that we had collected from calls to see trends. And lo and behold, we began to realize, wow, that guy's same name keeps popping up on multiple calls. That recruitment company, that labor broker keeps popping up on multiple calls. That fact pattern we heard keeps popping up on multiple calls. And eventually we came to realize that there are actually 25 distinct types of modern slavery that exist in our country today. There are 25 manifestations. And when you think about trafficking is profiting from the control and exploitation of others, what are all the ways that that manifests? We figured out that there's 25 manifestations, and almost any call or signal that comes into the national hotline can be bucketed into these 25 types. And in the early years, it was a pretty steep learning curve. Wow, we had never heard about it happening in elder care homes. Wow, we had never heard about it happening on motorcycle gangs. Now, we're beginning to see the patterns, and the learning curve is flattening out. So we could see on the sex side, it's in truck stops, it's in illicit massage businesses, it's in residential brothels, it's in hotels, it's online, on certain websites. On the labor trafficking side, it's in domestic work, it's in agriculture, it's in industrial cleaning, it's in landscaping, it's in construction, it's in fishing. And it's part of these industries. A sliver of these industries is where human trafficking is happening, right? So now we can begin to think of ourselves as fighting each of these piece by piece. So trafficking, when you're fighting trafficking, it's not fighting it all at once. When someone declares, I'm a modern day abolitionist, I'm just going to go out there and fight trafficking, what does that really mean if you're thinking about the crime as this kind of monolithic whole, where it's kind of the same everywhere? Trafficking is actually an incredibly heterogeneous crime. Some people call it a crime of crimes, where there's so many different manifestations. This criminal network is doing it this way. This other criminal network is doing it this way. This family is abusing the domestic worker in their home, right? And so when you think of it that way, you realize that the fight against slavery needs to be 25 distinct fights just in the United States. And different groups can take this on because a different intervention is going to be what strikes at that profit-risk equation for each of these types. So now we've begun doing maps like this, where this is done in Palantir, where we're studying hotline calls and we're connecting the dots of people, places, and things that we learned about, and we're beginning to learn about these national macro trends of, wow, that network has centralized concentration there, and that network has this node there, and this isn't actually completely disconnected crime. It's actually a national network that's working together, and we were able to piece that together and realize that. So imagine the power of understanding 25 different maps like this of each of the types of slavery in the United States. Then we could begin thinking about what are the vulnerabilities, what are the policies that need to change, what are the ways that we can intervene in different ways to disrupt the business model of the traffickers. So now we've begun to realize that as functioning as this national hotline, the national hotline functions at two levels. On one level, it's the lifeline for survivors, like Deborah and others who could have called in. And on the other hand, it's this national data hub that's then creating the strategic plan for all the different individualized fights that need to happen to actually begin to measure and reduce slavery piece by piece in the United States. But then let's think globally. We received a grant from Google and a grant from the State Department to call every country around the world and ask them, is there a human trafficking hotline covering the people who might be in human trafficking in that country? And what we ultimately learned was there's about 66 countries where there's some form of hotline or something that people who are held in slavery could signal or could call or could text if they have a mobile device. But for the other 130, or the majority of countries around the world, there's nothing. And so people held in slavery are actually experiencing that sense of hopelessness that Deborah and Tori and others felt, where they're on a fishing boat and have no idea how to signal that they're out there. They're stuck in a home in the Middle East as a domestic worker, and they have no idea how to signal when they're out there. There's somebody building a World Cup stadium who's a worker brought from Nepal to Qatar, and do they have any idea how to signal what's going on? So now we're beginning to think about, what does a global vision look like? How do we replicate what we've done in the United States? And we've already begun to replicate in Mexico with partners there, Canada with partners there, the UK with partners there, and Polaris so far has worked with about 16 countries, where we're trying to build, on the one hand, hotline infrastructure, and on the other hand, that data infrastructure to understand the crime that could position us for the final fight against slavery, where you're actually breaking it up into pieces and you understand that typology. So for us, imagine a world where the entire world has global hotline coverage, either through national hotlines or regional hotlines or a global hotline, but no matter where anybody is held in slavery around the world, all 21 million is able to signal for help. Imagine we could get to a world that exists. And then imagine we could get to a world where all 21 million people in slavery know that there is a number that they can call and how to signal for help, and all the collective outreach that we can do to reach folks in slavery and let them know that this is possible. And then imagine that world is then collecting that data and is able to create a global typology of all the different types of slavery by country and by region, and we can position ourselves for the final fight against slavery to begin reducing slavery piece by piece and work towards a world without slavery. So what I'd like to leave you all with is, what's it going to take to really end slavery around the world? It's going to take building a safety net for survivors. It's going to take prevention, it's going to take awareness, it's going to take political will, it's going to take an increase in funding, it's going to take survivor leadership, speaking out and saying this is what happened to us, because survivors are the biggest experts on trafficking, to speak out and say this is how it's happening and this is what needs to do to fight it. It's going to take gender equality, it's going to take economic empowerment, but what we've been working on, I think, are two pieces of the final solution. One being global hotline coverage for every survivor in the world, and two being better data to understand the crime, and then to really eventually flip that profit-risk equation, and so we decrease profit and increase risk, and we begin disrupting the business model of traffickers around the world. That's the vision we're working on. We're 14 years into it. I think we've got decades ahead of us. I hope you all will join us. I hope you'll think about the role that you can play in this fight. And we'll leave it there, but thank you all so much. And wonderful.